Welcome to the Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast, the show where you learn how to plan, build, and live the tiny lifestyle. I'm your host, Ethan Waldman. I've probably been talking your head off about the recent Tiny House Summit, and I promise this is probably the last time I will mention it. It was such a blast to put together, and I heard from so many of you who got so much from watching the sessions. It was such a success that the Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast is taking a much-needed break around the holidays. For the next few weeks, we'll be sharing old episodes from deep in the feed that you may not have heard, but that are some of our favorites. First up is one of my favorite conversations and probably the most popular episode of the show, my first conversation with Tiny House author, the legendary Lloyd Kahn. I hope you stick around. Oh, and if you celebrate, happy Thanksgiving.
I didn't want to spend my life creating something unique that was hard to build and took a lot of time. I wanted to have a house that I could get built quickly and that would be, comfortable and beautiful and keep the rain off and then get on with my life.
Welcome to the Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast, the show where you learn how to plan, build, and live the tiny lifestyle. I'm your host, Ethan Waldman, and this is episode 63 with Lloyd Kahn. If you don't recognize his name, you've probably seen one of his books. Lloyd published the seminal book Shelter in 1973, documenting alternative housing ideas not limited to, but including tiny houses, well before the current modern movement. Lloyd has a lifelong fascination with shelter, and in this conversation, we trace the steps of how an insurance broker from San Francisco built his own home and slowly transitioned to publishing internationally about geodesic domes, tiny houses, mobile houses, DIY building, driftwood shelters, and more. While many thousands of homes that Lloyd has documented over the years are small or tiny, he's got a healthy amount of skepticism about the modern tiny house movement. We'll talk about it all in this interview, so I hope you stick around. The Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast has been getting a lot of new listeners in the last couple of weeks. So if you're new to the show, let me say welcome. I'm glad you're here, and I hope you've subscribed in whatever podcast app you like to listen in. As of this week, there are 63 episodes for you to go back and listen to. There are a lot of amazing interviews that will help you plan, build, and live the tiny lifestyle. So I hope you delve into the archive and find something that really inspires you to move forward on your plans. Sharing your favorite episodes with your friends via email or even on social media is highly appreciated. A new episode of the show comes out every Friday, so definitely subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. All right, I am here with Lloyd Kahn. Lloyd Kahn is the former shelter editor of the Whole Earth Catalog and editor-in-chief of Shelter Publications. He has published a series of books on building, including Shelter and the legendary Tiny Homes Simple Shelter. There is an 8-page article on him in the current June edition of Surfer's Journal. Lloyd Kahn, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. I'm curious if you can tell me about how your fascination with shelter and just home began.
Well, when I was 12, I helped my dad build a house in the Sacramento Valley. It was a concrete block house with a concrete slab floor, and we would go up there on weekends. He had a rice farm up there, and he also wanted to go duck hunting, so he built a concrete block house, and my job was to shovel sand and gravel and cement into a concrete mixer. So I did that, and I don't know, maybe we worked for a year on weekends and holidays, and one day they gave me a carpenter's apron and nails and a hammer and let me go up on the roof and nail down the sheathing. And at that point, I realized I really liked building. And so, then I worked as a carpenter when I was 18 on the docks in San Francisco. And then I got really interested in shelter when I started building my own house in 1960. I was an insurance broker in San Francisco, and I would come home on early I'd get off work and come home and work until it was dark and work on the weekends. And so I started building then and sort of had to learn as I went along. And And then a series of steps led the way to me getting into publishing books on building, and I've been interested in building ever since.
Do you still live in the house that you built for yourself?
No, no, that house, well, the house I built in Mill Valley is gone. They demolished it so they could put a couple of large houses on the same lot. The house I built in Big Sur is there. It's about 2 miles north of Esalen on the Highway 1. And the house I'm living in now is I built this house in 1971. I started on this house. And so that's where I live now. Right now, we're in the production studio, which is about 100 feet from the house.
Very nice. I like that. I don't know how big your main house is, but I like to subscribe to the small house, big workshop methodology.
Yeah, yeah. I never thought of a large shop as a component. And yeah, well, the tiny homes thing is the good thing about the whole tiny homes movement is that things were getting too big, houses were getting too big, and this is going in the other direction. But the idea that two people can live in a 150 square foot space is not too realistic for most people. But tiny homes has certainly caught the imagination of everyone. TV shows, and which are mostly phony, and lots of attention to the concept. The thing that I think that of our books, the book Shelter is a lot more important than the book Tiny Homes. Shelter was published in 1973.
Right, and that came out in 1973, and it isn't just tiny homes; it's all kinds of alternative homes.
Right. Well, I was building geodesic domes in the 60s. Domes were the kind of the iconic house of the counterculture. We thought that domes were a better way to build, that they used less materials, that gave you more space. And after 5 years of building domes and publishing 2 books on dome building, I realized that domes didn't work. And Dome Book 2 had sold 160,000 copies by then. So I called up, one day I just thought, okay, that's it. I don't want any more domes on my karma. And so I called up my agent and said, I'm taking the book out of print. And he said, "Are you crazy?" And I said, "No, I'm so I stopped publishing Dome Book 2. It was really a good book. We had a lot of fun when we made it, but it was just on the wrong subject, and it was too appealing to people. And so I thought, well, I've got maybe 250,000 people who have read our books on domes. I should show them other ways to build. So I took off with 2 cameras, 2 Nikons, one loaded with color film and the other with Tri-X, and started photographing buildings in this country and Canada. And I went to England and studied the origins of building and started accumulating information. And in 1973, we published Shelter, which was an oversized book, 11 by 14 inches with 1,000 photographs. And it was, okay, here are all the different ways of building all around the world. And here's the history of building. And here is a section on materials, from bamboo to adobe to wood. Here are the heart of that book was 5 tiny houses where we drew the plans for each house. We drew every stick of wood, every rafter, every joist, every stud, and recommend that you start small, and maybe you start small and then add on as time goes by. So we really wrote the book on tiny homes about 45 years ago. It just took a while for everybody to get around to it. So anyway, so I just wanted to say that Shelter is really the pivotal book, and it still is. It's sold over 250,000 copies, and we did the Maker Faire about a week ago in San Mateo, which is a big event with something like 80,000 people coming. And we had a booth there and we sold books, and we had all day long people came up to us and said, I got this book, 35 years ago, and it changed my life. I built a house out of it. So anyway, that's there are 7 building books so far. But the Shelter is kind of it's kind of everybody's favorite building book.
My friend Deke Diedrichson is I think he's episode 2 on this podcast, and I've been to many of his various build workshops, and he actually recommended Shelter as one of his favorite tiny house related books way back then. And it's taken me this long to get you on the show, but I don't have it, but now I really want it.
Oh, well, after this is over, send me your address. I'll send you a few books. Also, Builders of the Pacific Coast, which I think is the best book that we've ever done. It's the book that it's kind of an odyssey of my travels up the coast. And as far as Deke goes, Deke, I don't know if you've seen that comic book that he did, the first book that he did. And there's a page in that book where he's sitting in a tree reading our book Homework. And so that's how I got to know Deke. And then Deke and I did we did a thing together, one of these home fairs. It was in Raleigh, North Carolina. So I didn't know Deke, and we met, and he had a booth there. He had an A-frame that was supposed to be put together by the organizers of the show. And so when we got there was nothing put together. So we had to scrounge around and get the materials, and the guy who was supposed to do it loaned us a skill saw and some drill guns and stuff. So over the course of about a day, we put together his little house. It was interesting to me that Deke, he's got such a great personality. He's so likable and easygoing and perfect for this era. He was a good builder. And so we had a great time. We built this little thing. We got it up, and actually, while we were there, I was working on this book, Tiny Homes on the Move. And so Deke said, well, and I had some proof sheets from the book. So he said, let's do a video of you. So he's made lots of videos. And so he made a film of me going through the pages of this book, and page by page, and saying, okay, here's a camper van up in British Columbia. Here's a woman that lives in a Vardo in the woods in England. And it ended up, when he posted it, it got something like 200,000 views. So anyway, so I have a history with Deke. He's just a great guy.
I agree. And he is a great builder too.
Yeah. And he's a musician and funny.
Absolutely.
And he can draw, so.
The guy's got it all. What can I say? Not to belabor it, I want to back up and I wanted to ask, what was it about domes that just didn't work? Because they've certainly fallen out of favor, but why?
Well, the whole thing is a roof. So if you have any kind of leakage, it's going to, so you're dealing with 100% roof. They're hard to subdivide. They're hard to add on to. Like if I want to add on to the building I'm in now, which is rectangular, I just go to a rectangular wall, exterior wall, and build a roof off of that wall. But if I want to add on to a dome, I have to tie into multiple different angles, facets, to add something on. And if I want to subdivide it, the same thing. Interior, like say a refrigerator and a chest of drawers and a bed, those things are rectangular. They're perpendicular to the earth. So if I want to put a refrigerator against the wall is curving. So that's a problem in terms of space. They tend to you have to use really high quality materials for domes. You can't have knots in the woods that you're using for the structure, for the struts. And once you cut them into 3 and 4 foot pieces, they're not salvageable. They're not useful for anything else. And on and on. And so when I when I took Dome Book 2 out of print, I had a lot of people were really upset with me, and like math science people, domes appeal to them, because they're mathematical. They're based on an abstract concept. And what I got around to understanding through a lot of years of building and observing builders is that I didn't want to spend my life creating something unique that was hard to build and took a lot of time. I wanted to have a house that I could get built quickly and that would be, comfortable and beautiful and keep the rain off, and then get on with my life. So what I did, I published a thing called Refried Domes, which we've still got copies of it, and we will send it out to anybody who really wants to know what happened with me and domes. And it's a 64-page newsprint publication. And it's kind of like, well, if you want to build a dome, here's my story, and here's why I don't think they work. But if you do want to build a dome, here's the mathematics. I'm not going to withhold this information. So I put all the chord factors in there, but at the same time, here's my experience. Here's 10 reasons I think that they don't work, and I think that there are, that's for domes as homes. For a theater or for a yoga studio or for something, it's different. But a home has got to function in so many ways that I think that it's just not. I don't advise people to build a dome. And my dome was in Life magazine, a 2-page color spread. It was the dome that I finally built. We built 17 domes at a quote alternative unquote high school, a hippie high school in the Santa Cruz Mountains. We tried out all kinds of different materials. They were built out of plywood, aluminum, polyurethane foam, shingles, and at the end of that building period, that's when we did Dome Book 2. And so I still get inquiries once in a while, but on our website, which is shelterpub.com, you can look down at the bottom, I think it is, and click on domes if you want to know about domes. The reason I got into publishing in the first place was I was living in Big Sur. I had built a house in Big Sur, which is this rugged coastal territory south of Santa Cruz. And I started building domes, and I had the mathematics for building domes, which had been published in Popular Science magazine under the title Sun Dome. And people were writing me and asking me for the math. So I would write back and give them the math and some things that I knew about domes. And then I thought, well, I'm sending the same letter over and over again. I should mimeograph something up and print it out and then just send it to these people. And that's when I met Stuart Brand, and he was coordinating all of the things that we were interested in the 60s. And he ended up coming out with the Whole Earth Catalog. And so I teamed up with Stuart and became the shelter editor of the Whole Earth Catalog. And that's how I learned how to make books. But it all came about because I thought this just isn't a very, it would just be a lot more efficient to print something. And so I've been, publishing books and communicating for almost 50 years now.
What do you think accounts for the current fascination with tiny houses?
Well, the housing situation is a big part of that. It's just so impossible. I just got a letter, an email a half hour ago from a friend who said she knows a friend of hers is looking for a place in the small town that I live in. She can pay up to $3,000 for a single person. And
per month, you mean, in rent?
Yeah, $3,000 a month. And San Francisco now, the rent for a studio apartment is like $3,500 a month. So it's just and so that's rentals. And then buying a home is pretty impossible in the San Francisco Bay Area. It isn't in small towns, and it isn't in, say, Central Oregon, but in San Francisco and Berkeley and Oakland and all around here. So that's the second thing, is that it's the cost of buying a house, the cost of renting is so prohibitive now that people have been looking around for other alternatives. And the tiny homes thing, it just caught fire. And the idea that you can put them on wheels and move them around, that appealed to people. And so I guess we called our book Tiny Homes and not Tiny Houses, because I think a home is more than a house. And so we published that about 4 years ago. I think it's sold about 120,000 copies now, and it's a hem. The best book out on tiny houses, tiny homes by far. It's got like 1,000 photographs in it. There's all kinds of books on tiny houses now, and so our book Tiny Homes is now way back in the Amazon listings. You can't control that, but so people, because of the cost factor, and then the simplicity and the mobility of tiny homes, and then also people can look at a tiny home and they understand it. Like, we publish these books, these little tiny books that are about 2 by 2 inches. I guess I don't have one right here, but they're about this big, and we give those away to people. So this is a mini book of the Tiny Homes book. I think we have 64 pages in each one of these books, and I give these little books to kids, like a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, and they will stand there and look through every page of this little book, and because they get it, they understand it. And so that's another thing about the tiny homes thing. But I think that our book on tiny homes was under 500 square feet. Then we did a book called Small Homes, which is 400 to 1,200 square feet. And that is a much more practical thing if you have 2 people and you're living in one of these little tiny things, you're going to have to get along pretty well to not murder each other. And one thing that some people do is they each have their own tiny home. But the small homes idea is, so the Small Homes book, which we did 2 years ago, it's not nearly as popular as the Tiny Homes book, even though it's a lot more practical, and it makes a lot more sense. And in the Small Homes book, I think we have 65 or 70 small homes all over the world, really, mostly in North America. And, we don't publish step-by-step building instructions, but we show what people have done. And so that's kind of where the progression of books has led me into small homes.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're a fan of tiny houses on wheels, but you think that they maybe get the size wrong in terms of a long-term solution for people.
Well, the wheels part of it, there's some things about tiny homes that I think are unfortunate. One is that everybody is putting them on trailers. The maximum width is 8 foot 6 inches, because that's the maximum you can take on the highway in California, or maybe in the United States. So they're narrow. And I've said to people, if you're going to build this thing and put it in a backyard and leave it there for years, why do you need it to be on wheels? Why don't you just make it on a foundation, so that if you have to move it, you rent a trailer, jack it up, move it, put it back down. And so that saves a lot of money. And so that's one thing I think about tiny homes. They don't need to be on wheels unless you're going to be moving all the time. And the other thing is this, the typical kind of what people think of when they think of tiny homes is a steep gable roof with a loft at one end and a ladder going up to the loft. Well, it's a really bad design. A ladder going up, easy to fall, get hurt. And then they're narrow, so they're 8 feet wide. And some of these tiny homes, they even have a partition in there. And I get claustrophobic when I go in one of those things. You've got a 8 foot wide space, and then you've got a partition. So you've got a 3 foot wide room. So then a lot of them have a recess for a porch for, where you can fit one chair. And that's unfortunate. It takes away space from the interior. So I think that kind of image of tiny homes is not much better. I think is the shape of a gypsy wagon, which has a curved roof. And the curved roof right away gives you a feeling of spaciousness. And then if you have windows at like eye level, then you're orienting to the outside and you don't feel claustrophobic. And so you have a bed at one end. There's no loft. You have a bed at one end and you have drawers under the bed. And so I think that's a lot better approach to tiny homes. They have all these TV shows on tiny homes now, and they're really pretty phony. I mean, they don't really, they want, they've got a formula. They want the couple, they've got two kids, they've got kind of like a macho builder. The husband doesn't know how to, hammer a nail, and then so it gets built, and then they show the couple seeing the place for the first time, and the little girl runs and puts her teddy bear on the bed, and they squeal with delight, and it's just all scripted, and it doesn't really have much to do with reality. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that they have contributed to tiny houses getting bigger, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, but it's the format of making a tiny house on wheels bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
And now seeing, 34-foot long triple axle tiny houses on wheels that have, a full bathtub, washer, dryer, dishwasher. In my opinion, it starts exceeding the boundaries of the usable format for that type of home.
Is that true? 30 foot long?
Oh yeah, I've seen some homes over 30 feet.
Ah, wow. On wheels.
Yes.
Yeah, well, not a trailer to hold up that's going to be a pretty expensive trailer.
Oh yeah, it's like a $12,000 trailer.
Yeah, well, probably part of it is when it's on wheels, it may not be subject to the building codes. So that's one reason that the wheels concept. But
right. It also disconnects the house from the land. So it allows you to invest in the house without having to worry about owning land.
Yeah.
But as you've said, a building that's built on skids absolutely can be moved.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be. I mean, it just can be a couple of girders underneath the floor joists, so that you jack it up. You could probably even jack it up in 4 places and then slide a trailer underneath it and then move it. So that's part of the thing, But so I think it's a good thing. It's a good thing that another thing is the fact that homes being built now are way too large, and certainly around here, and so that not only it takes a lot of money and materials and labor to build them, but they're expensive to heat and to cool and to maintain. So people can get by with a lot less. So I would hope that there are some people who are whether you can actually build your own home nowadays is around here. It's really almost impossible because of the cost of building permits and the things that they make you do, like putting in sprinklers in every house, which I think is absurd. Sprinklers in a restaurant make a lot of sense because of restaurant fires, but it adds $40,000 to the cost of a house. So it's we're back in the 60s. What everybody wanted to have 10 acres in the country and build a house. Maybe cut the trees on the property and use that to build the house, or in the desert adobe house. Now I think that if I were a young person now, I would go looking in small towns or on the outskirts of cities, at cities or towns that are not that haven't been discovered, haven't been gentrified. In the San Francisco area, it used to be Oakland, but forget Oakland. It's already, in the multi-million-dollar range for buying a house. But Richmond was a place, San Leandro, Hayward, Vallejo is where I would go looking right now because it's on the water, and there's old Victorian houses there. Or you find a small town, or in a town like, say, Richmond, where the crack dealers have just been run out of the neighborhood, and you get a little house that needs some work, needs fixing up, and you get that, and you already have wiring and plumbing and sewage, so you're not starting from scratch. And so I think that that's a viable thing to do for somebody if they would like to have a hand in building their own shelter these days.
Yeah, it sounds like the California environment in terms of legal requirements is just makes it really difficult. Here in Vermont, where I am, it's a lot different. Once you get out of Burlington, which is where I currently am right now, most towns don't even enforce building code because
Really?
they don't have the resources to do so, and there's still kind of if you want to build it and you want to live in a house that falls down on your head, like that's on you.
Wow.
So Vermont is still an option.
Well, do you know Warren, Vermont, in the
Oh yeah.
Green Mountains? Yeah. There's a lot of really interesting builders in that area, including Dave Sellers. He's an architect, and I've spent some time there. There's just a lot. Yes, the Yestermorrow School is there, which is a school of building that teach people how timber framing and how to do mortise and tenon, and
Yeah, they do really cool stuff.
yeah. Well, that's good. I mean, that's that there's freedom. Well, Vermont is kind of famous for a certain amount of freedom.
So I'm curious if you have a favorite structure, like of all time, across all of these structures that you've seen and documented. I know it's probably a tough question.
No, it's not a tough question. There's maybe two structures. One is well, in all these years of 45 years of building and photographing and interviewing builders all over the place, I run across the builder of my dreams. His name is Lloyd House, and he's up in British Columbia. And so he built a house there that has unfortunately burned down. But it was just the most perfect, beautiful little house that I've ever seen. And that's in our book, Builders of the Pacific Coast. Then there's a building in our book, Homework, built by Louis Fraser, who's my best friend now. And it was built based on the drawing of a Mandan earth lodge in our book, Shelter. And Louis saw this drawing and decided to build this shop with an adjacent circular bedroom. And so that's my other, favorite. Those places are like Lloyd's house. When I came up to it, I just sort of sat down and said, "Oh man, I just have to catch my breath here. It's just so beautiful." So there are wonderful houses here and there that I have run across, and I put a lot of them in our books. I mean, so we have 7 books on building, each with 1,000 photographs. So that's 7,000 photographs. And so there are a lot of those of things I think are really, kind of exquisite.
Well, I have so many now. I've like reached the end of my house related questions, and I feel like I'm standing at the bottom of a tree, and I could branch in any direction here.
Okay.
You've written about aging, and you're in your 80s, correct?
Yeah. 84.
My your secret?
Well, I chose very good parents.
Okay.
My dad lived to be 92 and my mom 103. So there's that. And then I'm just active. I think that what an awful lot of the drawbacks of aging are from inactivity and not just purely from the years ticking by. And so I actually had a 20-year period when I did books on fitness, I did the book Stretching by Bob Anderson, which has sold over 3 million copies and is in 23 languages. And then I did a book on weight training called Getting Stronger by Bill Pearl. And I did a book on running by Olympic runner Jeff Galloway called Galloway's Book on Running. So for those 20 years, I hung out with those guys and I did triathlons. I rode a bike, I swam, I ran. I'm mostly competitive running. So I sort of got it down there so that I just, you just have to keep active. If you don't, your muscles lose their lose their strength, and so I just I do something every day. I quit running competitively because my knees were gonna give me a problem, and I quit maybe 10 years ago, and I've started running again now, much slower. And but with 20 years of competitive running, I've got running figured out, and I know how to do it. And I just went last night for maybe 4 or 5 miles. I meet with my friends every Tuesday night. We meet at a pub at Muir Woods, and we run maybe an hour, hour and a half, and then we come back and drink beer in the pub. And so now I go off by myself because I can't keep up with anybody else. But I really enjoy being alone and just, hearing the sound of my footsteps and looking around and going slow if I want to. And so, it's just, I think the thing is to just stay active. It's a pretty low bar, for people in their 80s. I actually, this Friday, I'm meeting my high school friends for lunch. So we're like 85 years old, all of us. And there may be 15 guys will show up. And even though I went in a completely different direction from all these guys, in 1965 when I started smoking pot and was more interested in the counterculture than I was in making a lot of money, they're still my friends. And so, they're in varying, condition. They're actually, a really good friend of mine just told me last night he's going to have, he thinks, open heart surgery. So, keep my fingers crossed and just keep moving,
Do you think that there are benefits or particular challenges to aging in a tiny house?
No. Well, no, I don't think. No, I don't think so. I don't think it has. Your fitness, I don't think matters, and unless you're constrained by being in a tiny space. But I don't think so. No.
Probably no loft ladder in that case.
No. Or you have a pea pot, so you don't have to climb down in the middle of the night, Right. Yeah.
What are you working on now?
Well, I'm working on a book called Handmade, the Half-Acre Homestead. And it's basically 50 years of building, gardening, cooking, foraging, crafts, everything that we do here by hand. And I have the advantage in doing this book, the fact that I've been taking pictures for decades. And so the book will be out next year. It'll be out in the spring, like February or March of 2020. I think it's going to be a really good book. It's got, the house, the building of the house, the shop, the tools, my wife's weaving studio, food, foraging, how we gather firewood, everything you do to, have a shelter and food production on a small piece of land. Like half an acre is 100 by 200 square feet. And so, I kind of wrestle with the idea of, could you do this nowadays? I think you could actually. And I've come around to the idea of telling people, well, if you could figure out a way to support yourself for a year, save up enough money for a year where you don't have to work, you can get a house built you can get a pretty good start in a year working alone on a house. So if you are of a mind to do this, here's how we did it. And then here are other possible solutions. Maybe you fix up a loft in the city, or you buy a rundown house in a small town and fix it up. But the principle is that your computer isn't going to build a house for you. You still need your hands. You still need a hammer and a saw. Maybe it's going to be a nail gun and an electrical saw. But so that hasn't changed, and that's kind of an exciting thing. And so I'm saying to people, maybe you can't build a whole house, or maybe you can't even do an extensive remodel, but you can do something. And anything you can do for yourself with your own hands, including growing food and making whatever you can, will be of benefit, and it will be cheaper for you, and it will be something that you'll cherish, and it will be of a great value to you in your lifetime. And so I think that those things are still kind of the same for everybody. And so you just need to, go out. And I mean, I found places in small towns like the town of Colusa, which is in the Central Valley of California. I saw a house up there for sale, but it had a little barn in the backyard for $130,000. And so anyway, the kind of one of my missions, I guess, is that doing stuff with your hands. And the last thing I would say is that you're never going to be self-sufficient. I mean, we sort of thought that about that in the 60s. You wanted to grow all your own food. You can't do that at all. But what you can do is you can move in that direction, and you can do as much for yourself as possible. Maybe if you're living in New York City, you got chives and parsley on your fire escape, all the way to the other situation where you're building your own house from scratch. So it's just, the idea, it's like self-sufficiency is like perfection. You never get there, but that's no reason not to try to do as much for yourself as possible. No. End of commercial.
That's an inspiring commercial, I have to say. No, the book sounds awesome.
Yeah.
Maybe when it comes out, we'll have you back on the show to go in depth on it.
Oh yeah, sure. Okay.
Well, one thing that I like to ask all my guests is, what are 2 or 3 books that you recommend that have inspired you around, tiny houses or shelter or building or really anything?
The one book that always pops in my mind, nothing to do with any of that, was West with the Night by Beryl Markham. She was a bush pilot in Africa, and it's just so beautiful. It's one of those books that I'll read a paragraph and then I'll just put the book down and think about it for a while. Just, beautifully written book. As far as building goes, maybe the book that was pretty influential for me was called The Owner Built Home by Ken Kern, Kern, that I got in the 60s. And he was like an architect, but he was interested in experimental building. And so he has these really nice drawings of all kinds of things. And then other books, I don't know, books on building. There was a book called Your Engineered House, which I got in the mid 60s. And I used that book when I built my house in Big Sur. I used a lot of his techniques. I have thousands of books here. I have a really fantastic library of having to do with small buildings, as opposed to, architectural books on large buildings. And so I have books on thatching and I need to do something with these books, like get them to a university library or something, because they're just sitting here. But I mean, I've accumulated these books over 50 years. And I bought 2 of them yesterday in San Francisco.
Well, Lloyd Kahn, thank you so much for being a guest on the show. It was really wonderful talking with you.
Okay, well, thank you.
You can find the show notes and links to all of Lloyd's books, photos from his travels, and much more at thetinyhouse.net/063. Again, that's thetinyhouse.net/063. Well, that's all for this week. I'm your host, Ethan Waldman, and I'll be back next week with another episode of the Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast.